deportees were sent under a little-known third country arrangement without any known ties to Eswatini to speak to us about the legal and ethical questions around this. We're joined by Professor Sarah Paoletti, an expert in international law and human rights from the University of Pennsylvania. A very good evening to you, Professor Paoletti. We've seen discussions with the United States, with various countries of, some would say, a dubious human rights records of deporting unwanted, undesirable characters in the United States. Has there been a litmus test around all of these discussions, including in this case on the legalities and constitutionality around this?
So interestingly, the courts have not actually ruled on the legality of these third country removals as they're being carried out. In prior cases, the federal district courts have ruled only that they need an injunction. They need to pause the implementation of this policy until they have a chance to rule on it. In some cases, they have ruled that notice must be given to the individuals before they can be deported. And the Supreme Court, in an emergency petition filed by the government, said, well, we can't let that injunction stay. We're going to let the policy move forward, and then we'll debate the merits of what's going on underneath it all later. And so I think there is a real question as to whether or not these removals are legal, what notice is due to individuals as a matter of due process before they're deported under the U.S. Constitution and clearly under international law. Many of these removals implicate the right to non-refoulement and a violation of the country's obligations of non-refoulement and obligations under the Convention Against Torture and other obligations that the U.S. has.
And we know that the United States is not signatory to some of these international protocols and conventions, as you talk about, to do with torture in some cases that cover human rights of people seen as refugees, asylum seekers, etc. And in juxtaposition, the interesting thing is that it has accepted refugees from South Africa. So I'm just wondering how these processes work, particularly in terms of public oversight. There's a South African case, but there's what we're speaking about here, third country deportations.
So in these third country deportations, the Trump administration has been carrying them out with almost zero oversight. In fact, I would say zero oversight, right? The failure to provide notice to individuals, the opportunity to be heard in the courts before they're sent to third countries, the opportunity for any claims of fear of persecution or fear of torture being raised, none of that has happened. And so the most recent deportations, right, they happened overnight. They happened without any notice. And I think people are still trying to figure out exactly who these individuals are. And I think one of the really key things is to know that we cannot take at face value the characterization of these individuals as violent criminals. These are statements that are being made by this administration and by the Department of Homeland Security without any regard for underlying facts and without any presentation of any evidence that the individuals that they're deporting are in fact violent criminals or have any significant criminal history in their background.
Has there been, and by this I mean at least consensus, as in common cause understanding of what would be deemed somebody who's a threat to national security? Over the past couple of decades, there seems to have been some sort of understanding, including with President Trump's first tenure, there would have been some sort of consistency. Have the laws changed so much so that even what you may have done 10 years ago or what you may have said, not necessarily directed at the United States, could be interpreted as such, and therefore you could be described as, has been described in these terms, uniquely barbaric offenders and those who are just terrorists?
The laws have not changed at all. and that's what makes these removals so egregious. The laws have not changed, right? What has changed is the evisceration of any notion of due process and the right to be heard. So there has been no evaluation by a court or by public opinion as to the seriousness or the gravity of the alleged underlying criminal history for these individuals. It absolutely has not been brought before the courts as to whether or not they meet some threshold standard of violence, threat to security. It is simply being declared by edict, and then the deportations are being carried out. And so that is why the legal community and the human rights community and others are so up in arms about what is happening, because there is no basis in law for these current removals.
What about federalism and the role that it plays? Because it seems to me that this is as a result of national edicts, as you say, based on President Donald Trump's own values and principles in terms of his slogan of Make America Great Again. But we've seen tensions with some states where they're not in agreement with the ethos that President Trump is promoting. Have we seen states balk against this national practice?
We've seen states try, right? We have seen states say, we do not want to cooperate. We are not going to cooperate in these mass raids. We are not going to facilitate you running roughshod over our citizens and showing up at courts and intervening in our day-to-day lives. And I will say the states have not taken a very aggressive stance. And in anticipation of the states taking any stance in opposition, the Trump administration has explicitly threatened states that it deems non-cooperative, and municipalities. So most of what is happening in terms of resistance is happening at the local level, not even at the state level. And so it's municipalities, towns, counties, cities that are saying, we don't want ICE interfering with our day-to-day business. We want to be able to carry on the work of our courts, the work of our hospitals, our schools, our churches, without you stepping in and intervening. And those are communities and states and municipalities, cities that are being threatened with funding cuts or other threats. And so the federal government really is operating at full force with very few checks on its exercise of power.
Thank you so much for your time. Much appreciated. Professor Sarah Paoletti from the University of Pennsylvania speaking to us about legal and human rights concerns raised by particularly third country deportation arrangements that are playing out in the United States. This time we're talking about deportations to Eswatini with non-citizens.